In the beginning was the Word, and maybe not even just one, but what did he know about that? What he discovered at his point of origin was a stack of planks on wet grass, smelling of fresh resin and soaking up the sun with their yellow surfaces. He found nails in a plywood box, hammers, saws, and so forth. But visualizing all this, he observed that he was thinking the picture into existence rather than just seeing it. Only later did a weak sense of self emerge, when the bicycles already stood inside him, and 3 shelves, one above the other, covered his right wall. He wasn't really shed number 12 then. He was merely a new configuration of the stack of planks. But those were times he had left most pure and enduring impression. All around lay a wide, incomprehensible world, and it seemed as though he was merely interpreting his journey through it, making a halt here, at this spot, for a while. Certainly the spot could have been better, out behind the low 5-story prefabs alongside the vegetable gardens and the garbage dump. But why feel upset about something like that? He wasn't going to spend his entire life here. Of course, if he'd really thought about it, he would have been forced to admit that that was precisely what was going to happen. That's the way it is for sheds. But the charm of life's earliest beginnings consists in the absence of such thoughts. He simply stood there in the sunshine, rejoicing in the wind whistling through his cracks if it blew from the woods, or falling into a slight depression if it blew in from the dump. The depression passed as soon as the wind changed direction, of course, without leaving any long-term effect on the soul, still only partially formed. One day he was approached by a man naked to the waist, in a pair of red track-suit pants, holding a brush with a huge can of paint. The shed was already beginning to recognize this man, who was different from all the other people because he could get inside. To the bicycles, to the shelves, he stopped by the wall, dipped the brush into the can, and traced a bright crimson line on the planks. An hour later, the hut was crimson all over. This was the real first landmark in his memory. Everything that came before it was still cloaked in a sense of distant, unreal happiness. The night after the painting, he held up his tar-papered roof to the moon as he dried. Where am I, he thought. Who am I? Above him was a dark sky, and inside him stood the brand-new bicycles. A beam of light from the lamp in the yard shone through the cracks, and on the bells of the handlebars gleamed and twinkled more mysteriously than the stars. Higher up, a plastic hoop hung on the wall, and with the very thinnest of his planks, number 12 recognized it as a symbol of the eternal riddle of creation, so very wonderfully in his own soul. On the shelves lay all sorts of stupid trifles that lent variety and uniqueness to his inner world. Dill hung and scented herbs hung drying on the thread stretched from one wall to another, reminding him of something that never ever happens to sheds. But since they reminded him of it anyway, sometimes he seemed that he once might have been more than just a shed, but a dacha, or at the very least a garage. He became aware of himself, and realized that what he was aware of, that is himself, was made up of numerous small individual features, of the unearthly personalities of machines for conquering distance, which smelled of rubber and steel, of the mystical introspection of the self-enclosed hoop, of the squeaking of the soles of the small items, such as the nails and the nuts which were scattered along the shelves, and of other things. Within each of these existences there was an infinity of subtle variation, but still for him each was linked with one important thing, some decisive feeling, and fusing together these feelings gave rise to a new unity, defined in the space by the freshly painted planks, but not actually limited by anything. That was him. Number 12, and above his head the moon, was his equal as it rushed through the mist and the clouds. That night was when his life really began. Soon number 12 realized that he liked most of all the sensation which was derived from the transmitted by the bicycles. Sometimes on a hot summer day when the world around him grew quiet, he would secretly identify himself in turn with the Sputnik and the folding comma, which experienced 2 different kinds of happiness. In this state, he might easily find himself 40 miles away from his real location, perhaps rolling across a deserted bridge over a canal bounded by concrete banks, or along a violet border, or the sun-baked highway, turning into the tunnels formed by the high bushes lining the narrow dirt track, and then hurtling along, and until it emerged into another road leading to the forest, through the forest, through the open fields, straight up into the orange sky above the horizon. He could probably have carried on riding along the road till the end of his life, but he didn't want to, because what brought him happiness was the possibility itself. He might find himself in the city, in some yard where long stems grew out and the pavement cracked, and spend the evening there. In fact, he could do almost anything. When he tried to share some of his experiences with the occult-minded garage that stood beside him, the answer he received was that in fact there is only one higher happiness, the ecstatic union with the archetypal garage. So how could he tell his neighbor about two different kinds of perfect happiness, one in which folded away and the other had 3-speed gears? "You mean I should try to feel like a garage too?" he asked one day. "There is no other path," replied the garage. "Of course you're not likely to succeed, but your chances are better than those of the kennel or the tobacco kiosk." "And what if I like feeling like a bicycle?" asked number 12, revealing his cherished secret. "By all means feel like one. I can't say you mustn't," said the garage. "For some of us, feelings of the lower kind are the limit, and there's nothing to be done about it." "What's that written in chalk on your side?" number 12 inquired. "None of your business, you cheap piece of plywood shit," the garage replied with unexpected malice. Of course, number 12 had only made the remark because he felt offended. Who wouldn't by having his aspirations termed lower? After this incident, there could be no question of associating with the garage. But number 12 didn't regret it. One morning the garage was demolished, and number 12 was left alone. Actually, there were 2 other sheds quite close to his left, but he tried not to think about them. Not because they were built differently or painted a dull, indefinite color. He could have reconciled himself with that. The problem was something else. On the ground floor of the 5-story prefab where number 12's owners lived, there was a big vegetable shop, and these sheds served as its warehouse. They were used for storing carrots, potatoes, beets, and cucumbers, but the factory absolutely dominated every aspect of number 13 and number 14 was the pickled cabbage, in the 2 huge barrels covered with plastic. Number 12 had often seen their great hollow bodies girt in steel hoops, surrounded by a retinue of emancipated workmen who were rolling them out at an angle into the yard. At these times he felt afraid, and he recalled one of the favorite maxims of the deceased garage, whom he often remembered in sadness. "There are some things in life which you must simply turn your back on as quickly as possible." And no sooner did he recall the maxim than he applied it. The dark and obscure life of his neighbors, their sour exhalations, and obtuse grip on life were a threat to number 12. The very existence of these squat structures was enough to negate everything else. Every drop of brine in their barrels declared that number 12's existence in the universe was entirely unnecessary. That at least was how he interpreted the vibrations radiating from their consciousness of the world. But the day came to an end, the light grew thick. Number 12 was a bicycle along a deserted highway, and any memories of the horrors of the day simply seemed ridiculous. In the middle of the summer, when the lock clanked, the hasp was thrown back, and 2 people entered number 12. His owner was a woman. Number 12 did not like her. Somehow she reminded him of everything he simply could not stand. Not that this impression sprang from the fact that she smelled of pickled cabbage. Rather the opposite. It was the smell of pickled cabbage that conveyed some information about this woman. That somehow or other she was the very embodiment of the fermentation and the oppressive force of will which numbers 13 and 14 owed to their present existence. Number 12 began to think while the 2 people went on talking. "Well, if we take down the shelves, it'll do fine, just fine." "This is a first-class shed," replied his owner, wheeling the bicycles outside. "No leaks or any other problems, and what a color." After wheeling out the bicycles and leaning them against the wall, he began untidily gathering together anything lying on the shelves. It was then that number 12 began to feel upset. Of course, the bicycles had often disappeared for certain periods of time, and he knew how to use his memory to fill in the gap. Afterwards, when the bicycles were returned to their places, he was always amazed how inadequate the image his memory created was in comparison with the actual beauty that the bicycles simply radiated into space. Whenever they disappeared, the bicycles always returned. In these short separations from the most important part of his own soul lent number 12's life, its unpredictable charm. But this time everything was different. The bicycles were being taken away forever. He realized this from the unceremonious way that the man in the red pants was wreaking total devastation in him. Nothing like this had ever happened before. The woman in the white coat had left long ago, but his owner was still rummaging around, racking tools into a bag and taking down old cans and patching tubes from the wall. Then a truck backed up to his door and both bicycles dived obediently after the overfilled bags into its gaping Tyrolean maw. Number 12 was empty, and his door stood wide open. Despite everything, he continued to be himself. The souls of all that life had taken away continued to dwell in him, and although they had become shadows of themselves, they still fused together to make him number 12. But it now required all the willpower he could muster to maintain his individuality. In the morning, he noticed a change in himself. No longer interested in the world around him, his attention was focused exclusively on the past, moving in concentric rings of memory. He could explain this. When he left, his owner had forgotten the hoop, and now it was the only real part of his otherwise phantom soul, which was why number 12 felt like a closed circle. But he didn't have enough strength to feel really anything about this, or wonder if it was good or bad. A dreary, colorless yearning overlay every other feeling. A month passed like this. One day, workmen arrived, entered his defenseless open door, and in the space of a few minutes broke down the shelves. Number 12 wasn't even fully aware of his new condition before his feelings overwhelmed him, which incidentally demonstrates that he still had enough vital energy left in him to experience fear. They were rolling a barrel towards him across the yard, towards him. In his great depths of nostalgic self-pity, he never dreamed anything could be worse than what had already happened, that this could be possible. The barrel was a fearful sight, huge and pot-bellied. It was very old, and its sides were impregnated with something hideous, which gave out such a powerful stench that even the workers angling it along, who were certainly no strangers to the seamy side of life, seamed their faces away and swore. And number 12 could also see something that the men couldn't. The barrel exuded an aura of cold attention as it viewed the world through the damp likeness of an eye. Number 12 did not see them roll it inside and circle it around the floor to set it in its very center. He had fainted. Suffering maims, 2 days passed before number 12 began to recover his thoughts and feelings. Now he was different, and everything in him was different. At the very center of his soul, at the spot once occupied by the bicycle's wind-swept frames, there was pulsating, repulsive, living death, concentrated in the slow existence of the barrel and its equally slow thoughts, which were now number 12's thoughts. He could feel the fermentation of the rotten brine, and the bubbles rose in him to burst on the surface, leaving holes in the layer of green mold. The swollen corpses of the cucumbers were shifted about by the gas, and the slime-impregnated boards strained against their rusty iron hoops inside him. All of it was him. Numbers 13 and 14 no longer frightened him. On the contrary, he rapidly fell into a half-unconscious state of camaraderie with them. But the past had not totally disappeared. It had simply been pushed aside, squashed into a corner. Number 12's new life was a double one. On the one hand, he felt himself the equal of number 13 and 14, and yet, on the other hand, buried somewhere deep inside him, there remained a sense of terrible injustice about what had happened to him. But his new existence's center was located in the barrel, which emitted the constant gurgling and cracking sounds that had replaced the imagined whooshing of the tires over concrete. Numbers 13 and 14 explained to him that all he had gone through was just a normal life change that comes with age. The entry into the real world with its real difficulties and concerns always involves certain difficulties, number 13 would say. One's soul is occupied with entirely new problems. And he would add some words of encouragement. Never mind. You'll get used to it. It's only hard at the beginning. Number 14 was a shed with a rather philosophical turn of mind. He often spoke of spiritual matters, and soon managed to convince his new comrade that if the beauty consisted of harmony, and inside you, objectively speaking now, you had pickled cucumbers, or pickled cabbage, Then the beauty of life consisted in achieving harmony with the contents of the barrel and removing all obstacles hindering that. An old dictionary of philosophical terms had been wedged under his own barrel to keep it from overflowing, and he often quoted from it. It helped him explain to number 12 how he should live his life. Number 14 never did feel complete confidence in the novice, however, sensing something in him that number 14 no longer sensed in himself. But gradually, number 12 became genuinely resigned to the situation. Sometimes he even experienced a certain inspiration, an upsurge of the will to live his new life. But his new friend's mistrust was well founded. On several occasions, number 12 caught glimpses of something forgotten, like a gleam of light through a keyhole, and then he would be overwhelmed by a feeling of intense contempt for himself, and he simply hated the other two. Naturally, all of this was suppressed by the cucumber barrel's invincible worldview, and number 12 soon began to wonder what it was he'd been getting so upset about. He became simpler, and past gradually bothered him less because he was growing hard for him to keep up with his fleeting flashes of memory. More and more often, the barrel seemed like a guarantee of stability and peace, like the ballast of a ship, and sometimes number 12 imagined himself like a ship sailing out into tomorrow. He began to feel the barrel's innate good nature, but only after he had finally opened his own soul to it. Now the cucumbers seemed almost like little children to him. Number 13 and 14 weren't bad comrades, and most importantly, they lent him support in his new existence. Sometimes in the evening, the three of them would silently classify the objects of the world, imbuing everything around them with an all-embracing spirit of understanding. And when one of the new little huts that had recently been built nearby shuddered, he would look at it and think, "How stupid, but never mind. It'll sow its wild oats, and then it'll come to understand." He saw several such transformations take place before his eyes. Each one served to confirm the correctness of his opinion yet again. He also experienced a feeling of hatred when anything unnecessary appeared in the world, but thank God that didn't happen often. The days and years passed, and it seemed nothing would change again. One summer evening, glancing around inside himself, number 12 came across an incomprehensible object, a plastic hoop draped with cobwebs. He first couldn't make out what it was or what it might be, and then suddenly he recalled that there were so many things that once used to be connected with this thing. The barrel inside him was dozing, and some other part of him cautiously pulled in the threads of memory. But all of them were broken, and they led nowhere. But there was something once, wasn't there? Or was there? He concentrated and tried to understand what it was he couldn't remember, and for a moment he stopped feeling the barrel and was somehow separate from it. At that very moment a bicycle entered the yard, and for no reason at all the rider rang the bell on his handlebars twice. It was enough. Number 12 remembered. A bicycle, a highway, a sunset, a bridge over a river. He remembered who he really was, and at last became himself, really himself. Everything connected with the barrel dropped off like a dry scab. He suddenly smelt the repulsive stench of the brine, and saw his comrades of yesterday, numbers 13 and 14, for what they really were. But there was no time to think about all this. He had to hurry. He knew that if he didn't do what he had to do now, the hateful barrel would overpower him again and turn him into itself. Meanwhile, the barrel had woken up and realized something had happened. Number 12 felt the familiar current of cold obtuseness he'd been used to thinking was himself. The barrel was awake and starting to fill him. There was only one answer he could make. 2 electric wires ran under his eaves. While the barrel was still getting its bearings and working out exactly what was wrong, he did the only thing he could. He squeezed the wires together with all his might, using some new power born of despair. A moment later he was overwhelmed by the invisible force emanating from the cucumber barrel, and for a while he simply ceased to exist. The deed was done. Torn from their insulation, the wires touched, and where they met, a purplish-white flame sprang into life. A second later a fuse blew, and the current disappeared from the wires, but a narrow ribbon of smoke was already snaking up the dry planks. Then more flames appeared, and meeting no resistance, they began to spread and creep towards the roof. Number 12 came round after the first blow and realized that the barrel had decided to annihilate himself totally. compressing his entire being into one upper planks in the ceiling. He could feel that the barrel was not alone. It was being helped by numbers 13 and 14, who were directing their thoughts at him from outside. Obviously, number 12 thought with a strange sense of detachment. What they're doing must seem to them like restraining a madman, or perhaps they see an empty spy, whose cunning presence is one they must expose. He never finished the thought, because at that moment the barrel threw all its rottenness against the boundaries of his existence with redoubled force. He withstood the blow, but realized that the next one would finish him, and he prepared to die. But time passed, and no new blow came. He expanded his boundaries a little, and felt two things. First, the barrel's fear, as cold and sluggish as every sensation it manifested. And second, the flames blazing all around, which were already closing in on the ceiling plank animated by number 12. The walls were ablaze, the tar paper roof was weeping fiery tears, and the plastic bottles of sunflower oil were burning on the floor. Some of them were bursting, and the brine was boiling in the barrel, for which all its ponderous might was obviously dying. Number 12 extended himself over the section of the roof that was left, and summoned up his memory of the day he was painted, and more importantly of that night. He wanted to die with that thought. Beside him he saw number 13 was already ablaze, and that was the last thing he noticed, yet death still didn't come, and when his final splinter burst into flames, something quite unexpected happened. The director of Vegetable Shop 17, the same woman who had visited number 12 with his owner, was walking home with a foul mood. That evening at 6 o'clock, the shed where the oil and cucumbers stored had suddenly caught fire. The spilled oil had spread the fire to the other sheds. In short, everything that could burn had burned. All that was left was number 12, or the keys. The huts number 13 and 14 were now no more than a few scorched planks. While the reports were being drawn up and the explanations were being made to the firemen, darkness had fallen, and now the director felt afraid as she walked along the empty road with the trees standing on each side like bandits. She stopped and looked back to make sure no one was following her. There didn't seem to be anyone there. She took a few more steps, then glanced around again. She thought she could see something twinkling in the distance. Just in case, she went to the edge of the road and stood behind a tree. Staring intently into the darkness, she waited to see what would happen. At the most distant visible point of the road, a bright spot came into view. A motorcycle? Thought the director, pressing hard against the tree trunk, but there was no sound of an engine. The bright spot moved closer until she could see it was not moving on the surface of the road, but flying along above it. A moment later, and the spot of light transformed into something totally unreal, a bicycle without a rider, flying at the height of 10 or 12 feet. It was strangely made, and somehow looked as though it had been crudely nailed together out of planks. But strangest of all was that it glowed and flickered and changed color, sometimes turning transparent and then blazing with an unbearably intense brightness. Completely entranced, the director walked out into the middle of the road, and to her appearance the bicycle quite clearly responded. Reducing its height and speed, it turned a few circles in the air above the dazed woman's head. Then it rose higher and hung motionless before swinging round stiffly about the road like a weather vane. It hung there for another moment or two and then finally began to move, gathering speed at an incredible rate until it was no more than a bright dot in the sky. Then it disappeared. When she recovered her senses, the director found herself sitting in the middle of the road. She stood up, shook herself off, completely forgetting. But then, she's of no interest to us.